Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And we interrupt the International Booker Prize content to talk about another prize. Wow, where does he keep getting these ideas? This time the Dylan Thomas Prize. And so being the overachiever that I am, I went and read the entire long list. So actually the last book I read from the long list was also the last one that I needed to read for the shortlist. This one here, which I'll talk about in a second. And so this is a prize that is about particularly younger writers, sort of pitched at kind of under, I think it's 40. It's sort of the age, sort of a specific age kind of in relation to Dylan Thomas's life. And I find it's quite an interesting one for often books that have been either ignored or kind of didn't quite get the same love in other prizes. And also it's quite an interesting prize for the fact that poetry, non-fiction, or maybe not non-fiction, poetry, fiction, short stories, all kind of together. And so you end up with these really interesting mixes of books. So let's talk a little bit about some of these. I'll go through the shortlist bit by bit and let's go. First up, going alphabetically by the author's surnames, is A Spell of Good Things by bámi Adébáyọ. And this was longlisted for last year's Booker. And so I won't go into tons and tons of detail about the book itself because I've spoken about it quite a few times elsewhere. But essentially the core part of this is a family. We're looking at kind of their kind of day-to-day life, but particularly in sort of modern Nigeria, with sort of the politics of Nigeria and of the kind of micro and macro sort of scale. So the things that are happening locally in terms of local elections, all that kind of stuff, and the things that are happening for their family circumstances. So for example, we're watching as the sort of eldest daughter is trying to go to school and trying to really advance her education. But in the meantime, the sort of school, the family is constantly running out of money. And this becomes a real fear. This then sort of leads to sort of these odd situations where one of the sons of the family decides that he's going to start begging to get some money, and it becomes this sort of odd thing where he's sort of participating in sort of things that are somewhat immoral in terms of pretending to be blind or deaf to kind of appeal to people's sympathies to make money, but all in order to get money for his sister to go to school. And in the meantime, you've got this sort of people are kind of in and out of bits of politics of, very much if I scratch my, scratch your back, if you scratch mine, whatever that, I've just butchered that phrase, you get what I mean. And so this book sort of does this sort of tale of how this family kind of moves and tries to make it through the world in that sense. Next up, we have Small Worlds by Caleb Azumah Nelson. And his first book, Open Water, I thought was gorgeous as well. Small Worlds is also just a really interesting book that takes kind of various points in time in South London, sort of three summers, and sort of does with that this sort of almost love letter to music. It's a novel that really celebrates these characters trying to make it through and the kind of music that informs that. All of which I'm making it sound trite. It's not trite at all in the book, I think. But there's this really sort of passionate way that these characters are trying to interact with each other. They're trying to, express the things deep within them. They're trying to make relationships work. They're trying to kind of get through life. And music is this sort of backdrop of the book. And I think what makes this sort of particularly spectacular as a book is the way that this book is able to, can I say book any more times? The way that the narrative is able to kind of keep this sort of rhythm that is very musical in its own way. So this book feels not only like a love letter to music, but also is music. It's sort of a very, it's just really beautiful to kind of let wash over you. I just think this is a real achievement. And it's also just great to see this book get some love, because I think it's one of those books that, particularly because Open Water was just this really special book. Really sort of nice to see Small Worlds, the follow-up book, getting some love as well. I think it's a really, really beautiful little novel. Next up, we have The Glutton by A.K. Blakemore. This book is wild. So it takes as its inspiration a story that is sort of believed, I think, to be true, but kind of at least mythologized in some way, of sort of, I want to say 18th century France. I might be entirely wrong about the time frame, but kind of olden times in France, and a character called Terare who cannot stop eating, and to the point of kind of this sort of almost mythological level. So if you sort of think back to kind of Gulliver's Travels or those sorts of types of story where you've got kind of this otherworldly thing or person, but they're kind of human-like, but they do non-human-y things, or like a very exaggerated form of humanity. In this book, Terare just keeps eating and eating, and at first that looks like sort of eating kind of lots of food, sort of actual normal human food, and that advances or devolves, whatever you want to think of it as, into things like eating metal or eating pig swill or eating anything and everything, and it's just this very strange book that just keeps unfurling. And on the surface, I thought this might be too silly, or it might be a bit too odd. There's something utterly charming about this, at least I found. There's something very compelling about the writing style that often tells the story of Terare's kind of gluttony, but does so in a way that doesn't really feel like Terare's being called out. It's never sort of like, oh, look at this ridiculous figure. It's sort of, what is happening biologically here? How do we sort of make sure, Terare's sort of sense of shame or lack thereof sometimes, sort of what make this really compelling, that Terare is just this fascinating character who's allowed to exist in the world kind of as a semi-tragic figure, because they can't stop, and if they do stop, they kind of they feel quite unwell, and they sort of feel very strange. It's a very odd book, but it somehow manages to tap into that kind of the kind of language and speech of the time. I say, having not existed in the 18th century, but yeah, it kind of taps into that whilst also just maintaining this real sort of modern sensibility of just humour and silliness. It feels, it's quite an odd achievement as a book, and I enjoyed this far more than I thought I was going to. Next up, we have Bright Fear by Mary Jean Chan. And I've mentioned this book sort of elsewhere on my channel, but Mary Jean Chan is a poet, and their first collection, Flesh, I thought was gorgeous as well. This one, Bright Fear, I think is equally as brilliant. So this is a collection that really looks at, particularly in some ways, COVID and the pandemic, but it does sort of so much more. It kind of, as a starting point, looks at paranoia and closeness and intimacy and all these other things, and it kind of extrapolates out using the pandemic kind of as sort of a point for that. So it will look at the ways that something like a pandemic can turn an ordinary person who you might otherwise have seen on the street into an enemy, into somebody to be feared because they could be contagious. And it takes that and sort of runs with it into these other really interesting ways of, other ways in which humans can be seen as threats to other people, and the ways that we crave closeness but also crave privacy and sort of being away from people. I think Mary Jean Chan is just brilliant. There's something about each poem where you sort of feel like she's going one way. She does something really quite clever with language, and then you're just sort of like, I don't know how she just did what she just did. I don't even know fully what she just did, but it's incredible. And I'm constantly amazed by what she is able to do with language. There's something very spare and very precise and very pointed about the language choices in her poems that I find so compelling and so brilliant. Next up, we have Local Fires by Joshua Jones. And these are a set of short stories that are kind of interconnected. They're all set around the town of Llanelli in Wales. And it's a group of people who, in many ways, they're sort of the world around them and they're not fully part of it. Things are happening. They're kind of just hanging out in their normal haunts all the time. And they are sort of living this life, but also feel kind of contained. There's something where they sort of want to really go and do something big, or they want to go and achieve something, but also something stops them and strips that back. But also there's something about that stripped back nature that's also really compelling, because they are this group of friends who just hang out and know each other very well. And it particularly kind of touches a lot on kind of on queerness. It touches a lot on neurodiversity, and there's something really interesting, I think, about the ways that Joshua Jones is able to kind of weave that into a story where it doesn't feel like the main focus. You know, it's a trans woman talking to somebody else about something. The short story titles often almost feel like these little jokes or asides in and of themselves. There's one that references The Simpsons. There's one that references some other stuff. It's a weird sort of jamboree of things. And it really works. There's something really compelling about the ways that he tells these stories that I just think is really interesting. There's something beautiful about kind of focusing on what in theory could be the mundane in terms of sort of this town that, you know, where people kind of like where they're from, but they also kind of don't. And there's something about the way he kind of amps up the ways that they talk about their lives without over dramatizing things. This isn't sort of shock horror, big thing happens. It's sort of people in the town talk, go and do this thing, something happens. And I love that about it, this sort of real rootedness in where it's from. And last but not least, Biography of X by Catherine Lacey. I think this is a really fantastic book. This is kind of one of those books, really, that I think, because it didn't get longlisted for the Booker, which I think was an oversight. Personally, I would have had this on my long list because I think it's brilliant. I think also it's just sort of one of those books I just think really deserve to get a bit more love. The core idea of it is that we have a central character and her partner has died. And in trying to kind of reconstruct her story, she basically keeps finding out other details about this sort of almost shapeshifter of a woman. So we're told, you know, she's a performance artist and she does all these she's this sort of public persona, but then equally everybody only seems to have a different slice of her. So, you know, there'll be somebody who dated her years and years before, but actually under a different name. And then after she left, that other person thought that she died, and she changed name, and then she does something different, and then there aren't really records of that person either, and so she just keeps moving through the world in a way that almost makes it feel like her life is a performance piece, and or that she's just trying to escape ever being too close to someone. And as you kind of read this book, I at least for me, I got the feeling that almost this is you know, X, the sort of central, this woman who's sort of being spoken about, is almost herself this enigma who doesn't want to be understood. It almost feels that she's scared of this kind of intimacy of being so close to somebody that they can know her, whatever knowing means in this context. And so she sort of just keeps disappearing. And so we're kind of left with this feeling in this book that maybe she's not actually dead. Maybe she's almost done a sort of, you know, the whole Elvis is still alive kind of style thing of she's somewhere else, pretending to be somebody else, and hiding in plain sight. And there's something about the way this book is constructed with the kind of the slow domino fall from our central character who's trying to understand more, where we kind of both think that she's entirely right to believe that she knows this person better than anybody else, but also that she could be entirely wrong. And I found that really brilliant. I thought this was so clever. I really, really love this book. I think it's just exceptional. And just a really compelling, fun, sexy, interesting, thought-provoking story nonetheless. So with all of those together, my personal preferences, as you may be able to tell, are Mary Jean Chan's Bright Fear and Biography of X by Catherine Lacey, both of which I think are exceptional. But really, all 6 of these books I think are great in several ways. They're sort of this really interesting set of narratives, really talking about place, about belonging, about identity in these really fascinating ways. And also kind of playing around with what fiction can do. I think they're all very, very clever and interesting, and I'd be quite happy for any of them to win. But Biography of X or Bright Fear would be my personal favourites. Anyway, I've been Bob the Booker talking about these books. I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you enjoy any of the books that you've read of this, and or check out any others. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.